Hello, 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 hello. I guess as you sort of come into the conversation, I want to greet you like my grandmother greeted people when they came to the porch, right? So I am from Mississippi, Gulfport, Mississippi, a beautiful coastal town down and on the coast of Mississippi. And when people used to come into her porch, she used to say, "Welcome, welcome, 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 welcome to this place." So I am so happy to have you here. I hope that this time that we have together, we're going to go roughly, I'm going to try to just go for about 40 minutes. And then, but I am going to break this up and have some conversations before, because I know how sometimes people have burning questions and how that can work, right? And so you may want to get a question in. So what I'll do is I'll do things in segments because I'm going to actually talk about 4 elements today. And one of them is that I want to, again, let's get right into it. So right now, America is doing America 250, right? Because now we're going into this idea of, 250 years from the Declaration of Independence. And when we look at that story and we know that story, my hope is that you go, okay, you have some interest in it. So throughout, the nation, wherever you're living, wherever you're at, your county or your state is doing America 250. And I'm going to encourage you to engage, right? And so, first of all, the civic engagement and just making sure, right, that, you are, from the Hamilton play, in the room where it happens. Okay, so now let's get why I brought that up. So, like, I don't know how many of you know that, again, a little bit about the Declaration. It was basically, it was 5 folks who were supposed to be on it, but the principal person who wrote wrote the Declaration is Thomas Jefferson. He's complex. He actually represents a lot of what America is. He's a paradox. On one hand, he hates slavery, and at the same time, he is living by it. And so he's riddled with contradictions. And with that said and done, I just want to read just a little bit from, I want to share something with you about the Declaration. So the Declaration of Independence has, it's a document that really sparked movements. So that's the reason I'm starting off with the Declaration. It's at and it's 250. It's that the Declaration would spark the women's rights movement. The women's rights movement grew out of the abolitionist movement, a movement that I'm going to be talking about today. And then also, it is going to help to spark the revolution movements that we know, like the Black Panther Party, the idea of going into liberation movements and Black liberation movements. So therefore, right now, the conversation is, again, it's a way to divorce people from what we actually, when I say we, I'm talking about as a nation, how groups that have been on the move and the cusp of, sparking revolution and wanting to have changed. What we did was that we made sure, again, the nation and the people who were, again, fighting against oppression, what they did was they held the document up and say, don't live in contradictions. Do not live in contradictions. And that's going to be powerful in our conversation today. Now, let me just tell you a little bit about the Declaration. So the Declaration had actually a grievance that was anti-slavery. You heard me. There was an anti-slavery grievance. And out of that grievance, it was actually struck down by, well, I'm going to basically call them the bourgeoisie of the South, right? They were the people who had the interest, in those enslaved folks. And what happens is that in the enslaved humans, those people who were engaged in human trafficking, even though Thomas Jefferson basically said, hey, look, this grievance, and what he did, he made the grievance, and I just read a little bit about it for yourself. The Declaration is 168 words, and what he did is that he condemned slavery, and he condemned the Atlantic slave trade, and he said that it was a cruel war against human nature itself. Now, again, I want you to stick to that, because here's a person who is a slave owner. Now, this is going to be very important in the way that we have our conversations today, because I'm going to be talking about systems. I'm not talking about personalities. I'm talking about systems. So here's a man who was so entrenched in a system, that on one hand he abhorred it, but at the same time he couldn't live without it. Well, he chose not to live without it. And so what happens is that what he did is that he actually blamed King George for the imposing slavery upon the colonies. And again, it was removed because as an appeasement to the southern states. But what he did was that he said that that slavery violated the most sacred rights of life and liberty. He basically talked about how it was, again, this war, right, against humanity. And I bring that up because when we sort of look at those words, those magic words in the Declaration that again have sparked various movements. I told you already it was the women's rights movement, it was which brought the abolitionist movement, but then you also have the revolutionary movements. And even when we went against in the American War, or in America we call it the Vietnam War, then the Viet Cong, they were quoting the Declaration of Independence. And so you see this document. So I like to say that although there's conversations now that tries to, say, oh, the document wasn't written for A, B, and C, it doesn't mean that it's not inspirational and it inspires movements. So I want to get that right there, right out front to you. That, and this is the beautiful thing, especially about people who can analyze, right? It was this woman, her name was Elizabeth Freeman. She was in Massachusetts. Allegedly, the story goes, is that she was walking by and she heard the reading of the Massachusetts state constitution. The very next day, they say, or right soon after, she went to an abolitionist lawyer. And she says, I'm no dumb critter. Won't the law give me my freedom? And she successfully, joining another lawsuit, she successfully sued. And that's how Massachusetts, right, came up with its emancipation laws. So I'm saying that to say that please, when people try to say what the document is not, right? I want you to think about how it inspires movements. And some of those movements I'm going to talk about today, particularly one that's one of my favorite people, okay? So what happens is, and I just have to read sort of the piece because it becomes, again, the words that really resonate. It's that I'm going to start off with the unanimous declaration of the 13 United States of America, when in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them to one another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitle them. A decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to separation. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. To secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their powers from their just powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive to this end, and this is crucial here, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers, such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Now, later on, it talks about the long trains of usurpations. And then later on, it talks about it is the right, it is the duty of people to overthrow such governments. So right now, what happens is that when you're now looking at why people don't want the documents to be read, in the 1960s, one of this document, the Declaration of Independence, sparked a lot of the movements that we know that created substantial changes in America. Because what it did, again, this document was a challenge document. It's either you're going to say what you're going to do and be who you say you are, or you're not. So again, the Declaration of Independence is almost like the moral compass or moral fiber of this nation, but then at the same time, it's the challenge. Now, what happens is the Constitution is the law of the land, but the Declaration is the spirit. And so I bring that up because when you're now looking at revolution, and that's what I'm going to be talking about today, and I'm talking about the people who came to this, basically who, this, who end up coming and shaping ideas. And then when I say they come, that can be through force, right? It can be through volunteer, but when they get here, right, they now are shaping and influencing. And so when we sort of look at, again, the importance of the document, right, moving forward, I really want you to read it, and I want you to really understand that it sparks revolution, right? And that's what makes it dangerous. Like one of the things that I do is I teach. And my students, I can ask students anytime, I say, well, how many of you read the Declaration of Independence? And if I had, like this past earlier this semester, I had 112 students. I said, how many of you read the Declaration of Independence? And out of that, right, I had 2 students. But when I asked them, how many of you have been tested on the Declaration of Independence? All 112 raised their hands. So what we're going to do is that, because again, there's an agenda with that. And that's why I want us to talk about and know that. So now let me just go back to why we're having this program today. So in this conversation, while we have African American History Month or Black History Month, it's really is not something that is a set of, it's not something that is here to have a separate history, because you understand, as Carter G. Woodson said, and I have to give you the quote of Carter G. Woodson that I so love, and he says it better than I said. I can say it. Carter G. Woodson said that it is not so much a Negro History Week, because it started off as a week, as it is a history week. We should emphasize not Negro history, but the Negro in history. What we need is not a history of selected races or nations, but the history of the world, void of national bias, racial hatred, and religious prejudice. So he chose February, selected February, because of Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass. Again, 2 people who strived, right, for different reasons, but strive for, preservation of humanity, right, and also going for and against the system of slavery. Now, at this moment, I want to sort of give you an idea about where and how important that history is. I really like a poem. It's by Langston Hughes. And that's what I'm going to start off my really formal remarks with, right? Is that it is Langston Hughes, my favorite poet. He says, I too sing America. I too sing America. I'm the darker brother. They send me to eat in the kitchen, but when company comes, I laugh. I eat well and I grow strong. Tomorrow, I'll be at the table when company comes. Nobody was dare say to me, eat in the kitchen then. Besides, they'll see how beautiful I am and be ashamed. I too am America. So at this moment, when we're now talking about this history, I'm talking about American history, but I'm also talking about the people from what we consider to be at a hierarchy. When there was a system that was put in place, I'm going to have some remarks about that. But when the system was put into place, there was a hierarchy. And that hierarchy, right, gave position to an elite class, right, and that bourgeoisie class. And when that class emerged, what they did was that, they, created these systems intact. And when they created those systems, what they did is they worked in division. So I just wanted to let you know that African American History Month is not a month of division. It's a month of sort of looking at history and looking at it from not a contribution piece. So I'm not going to be here giving you some names and telling you whose ideology is this or that. I'm going to actually be talking about the systems and how they got in place and how they basically are well-oiled. And it's up to, and what we've seen in African American history and African Americans in history is how they disrupted that system from below before they got the vote, as they face lynching, as they face all of these obstacles. It's really a beautiful story. It's a beautiful story of how people from below, right, have created and implement change. So let me go at it with that. So right now, there was an incident that happened in America during something called the colonial period. This is any period before the American Revolution. And so what happens is they had a something called Bacon's Rebellion. So let me tell you, it was really about two elite people. One of them was he was a governor. I can give you his name, Berkeley. You may not remember it, so I'm not going to really get too much into the specific names. But it was a guy. He was a governor, and his younger, like it was like a younger relative through marriage, came in, and they wanted territory. They wanted to have, they wanted to, he wanted to, claim some land, right? Other people's land, but he wanted to claim this land. And so initially they were going back and forth, and then eventually there was a war that broke out. Even just like we have the Declaration of Independence that I just started off, this guy named Nathaniel Bacon, he actually ended up creating his own declaration of, declaration of called Declaration of the People. And in that, he lists grievances. Just like I told you, there were 28 grievances, and one up was stricken out in the Declaration of Independence. Well, he lists grievances. And in those grievances, what he talked about was, judicial corruption. He talked about taxation. He talked about, again, hostilities with natives. He talked about raising an army and what that did. In in essence, what he was doing and what he ended up collecting was that he collected a group of people, particularly when we deal with enslaved and free Black people. He basically, and he worked and he got together other poor people. And basically, he got them behind this idea of, fighting for liberation. Now, what happens is in this fight for liberation, what he did was he again, he rallied behind you all. He was actually winning, right? He even burned down Jamestown. I mean, again, now why is this important? Jamestown was essential because it was a tobacco industry, right? So basically, it led to a lot of increased population to what we would now know to be, the colonies, the British colonies. And what happens is he came there and he was, they were winning. And next thing you know, they end up, this interracial across sort of class lines, right? They defeated the elite, but then he gets sick and he dies in the middle of the conflict. And so the governor gets control of the land back control through militia, get control. And what they start to do at this moment is that they now start to use the law. And when they implemented the law, they even created a concept that we know and we think that is sort of just there. But this is a way that the bourgeoisie came about and created these systems. They end up creating or facilitating and using phenotype. So the first time that the word white ever appears in world history is in 1671. Because again, people didn't see themselves like that. They saw themselves in like nation states, ethnic ties, and the like sort. But what Bacon Rebellion did was that it basically hastened the labor laws. So you have the elite; they can make sure they can do two things: that make sure that there was never an interclass, interracial army that emerged again. And then also to solidify their power and to give a stabilized labor force. Now, why do I bring that up? This Bacon's Rebellion that I'm talking about, it started 100 years before the Declaration was written in 1776. This event happened in 1676. And so what you see is that now this conversation, we start to get more and more conversation, but I want you to sort of know, I can start the story of, Black people in Africa, but I'm starting now from, again, something that from the very major crop in America, tobacco at the time. And then you now see how Black people were fighting for their liberation, because what Bacon's promise was that, hey, look, you all can get a cut of this pie. And what you see is that they've joined because they wanted to participate and they wanted to exercise and to be free. So, but one of the first major skirmishes between the elite, right? Black people were people who were classified as Black. They were right there in the center. They were in that defining moment. And I say this to say, because in every war that America has ever engaged in, Black people have participated. And so what then happens is the next piece that we sort of see, this next story is going to come up with the American Revolution. Now, with the American Revolution, right, you get in this piece, it was also integrated, right? And you have people who, we have, roughly, anywhere from 5 to 9,000 people who, participated in the Continental Army. And again, and then now that's on the American side. On the Loyalist side, it was over 20,000. And if you ever want to look up more information, I'm going to send you quite down some rabbit holes. But one of the information that you can look at is something called the Book of Negroes, where you can see the loyalists, the names of the loyalists, and the 20,000, or a good number of those people who fought for their freedom. So again, I'm saying that to say that the story of Black people, or the story of the Negro in history, is also about how people who they saw an opportunity to be freer, and they seized it. Now, this is going to be so crucial when we look at party politics, right? Because for the most part, what they saw was the class solidarity of being free, again, having more liberty, right? Because in the language of the revolution and during the language of this time, it was always liberty. Again, these words about democracy that's come in that can be very interpretive. It's again, some of this newer conversation. So now I want us to then, so we're now looking at, so that first part that I want to sort of engage with, it's like when you look at 1676 and 1776, what you see is this story about how people work to be freer from below. Now, when phenotype is used, it gets stigmatized, right? So what happens is they're saying these people, because over the time between a little bit before then, but most definitely after 1676 to the start in the beginning of the American Revolution in 1775. The revolution started 1 year before the Declaration. And what happens is that what you saw is that the law now is hastening, right? It's basically defining race and defining gender. So it's creating divisions. So the law is creating divisions to help get control of the masses of people. And so they cannot create a type of ideology that does two things. And again, I want you to remember these words: competition and scarcity. So the goals is that of the elite is always to have people believing that they have to compete for resources and that somebody, is taking that out. That helps to create a scapegoat. And then also it's the scarcity, right? So those are two major words I want you to sort of remember when I now move forward with the next conversation. So one of the women that I admire a lot, and that, her husband gets, her husband in later years gets a lot more recognition that she gets, and that's Shirley Graham Du Bois. And so what happens is I'm going to really talk about her. She is like the hero of the hour. Because in essence, she wrote a book, she wrote a pamphlet. She was over a journal. It was called Freedom Ways. And she talked about the contributions of Black people to the American Revolution. Because what she was showing was that she was saying that they had been erased. The story had been erased. And so what happens is it really goes to using the language of the bourgeoisie about who owns something. When you erase people from a story, that's why Carter G. Woodson said it's not Negro history, it's the Negro in history. Because when you erase people from a narrative, you also then say, well, these people were more, especially when you're using about who owns, right? It's like with capitalist language about who owns, who's producing, right? Then what happens is that they have more of an ownership. So when you sort of took the Blacks out of the story, that basically, gives the independence, the sovereignness to the nation, then it's like almost like it's not that they're not equal partners. They're not sharing partners in the narrative. And so, and I'm going to pause there for a few seconds because that's like phase one. And again, our thesis of our person of the hour is Shirley Graham Du Bois. And again, she wrote a wonderful essay about the American Negro in the American Revolution. And again, it's the story about and not erasing. So again, I just talked about the colonial period, and now I'm going to go in the next phase of history, which is going to be the antebellum period. But for right now, I want you to sort of take away some pieces here. One is that Thomas Jefferson is a paradox. That's why if you go down to DC and if you look at the King statue, what you're going to see is King seems to be looking at a figure. If you Google it right now, you can see, go Google Martin Luther King statue in DC. And you're going to see that Martin Luther King is looking intently at something. That something is the Jefferson Memorial. Because in essence, he has Lincoln to his back, because Lincoln represents emancipation. He's in the center of that. And then Jefferson represents the paradox, because Jefferson gives like the, the moral charge. Again, I'm not saying that he was a moral person. I mean, he's the hero, or, a deity. But what he does is that he sets up that argument that Black people would use throughout their history. Even Ketanji Jackson, when she gave a statement recently, talk about, again, how we're looking at these formations of these more perfect unions. Barack Obama, when he was in Philadelphia, when he was running for office, he talked about, again, that more perfect union. So what happens is the Declaration of Independence is our, if you will, it is the document that helps to use, that sparks and underlines the idea of revolutionary thought. And in a second, I'm going to talk about that even more. But I want to pause here just in case there's any questions. So Dee, could you see if there are any questions? I'll give it a few seconds.
Okay. If you have any questions, please click the picture of the hand on your control panel. We will not be able to read questions in the question box, so please be encouraged to verbalize your contribution. So I'm looking for raised hands, and I see none.
Okay, so I'm going to move forward, but as
may I ask a question?
Okay, yeah, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I'd like to. Can you emphasize the relationship of Bacon's rebellion to the permanent enslavement, to the court determined permanent enslavement of Black people? And were Black people permanently enslaved all prior to Bacon's rebellion? Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I love that question, and I can really answer it very quickly. That's why I want you to know Bacon's Rebellion. I want you to go down that rabbit hole, right? Because it's certain things happen. So right now, there was an ambiguity. So when people first came to the country, there was an ambiguity. Remember, there was the concept of phenotype-based race. Slavery was not, no, we don't go around and say white people enslave white people, because Greeks enslaved Romans, right? Romans enslaved Greeks. Okay, and so what happens is they had the military, Greeks had the letters, and so we have this Greco-Roman society that is the base for Western culture, right? And so what happens is that when we look at these when we look at the conversations of what happens when the colonies, the British colonies, were populating for labor. That conversation about phenotype-based, race was not necessarily fixed. So you had people who came over. There were various conditions, and they could work themselves out of slavery. They can have extended contracts, but it wasn't permanent. And so what we're going to see is that over a period of time, you're going to see now places like Maryland and Virginia, they're going to start to say things like the status of a child follows that of the mother. They're going to start to say and use the law. But what Bacon's Rebellion is going to do is going to really accelerate the conversation of race. What it's going to do is going to give this idea that it's going to now use the law. They're going to now say, okay, now these are things that Black people cannot do. These are things that women could not do. Like, for example, white women couldn't, beforehand, white women could marry are, getting relationships with Black men. But then now the law is going to come in and say, oh no, we're going to stop that, right? You can't get into those types of relationships. And it started beforehand, but now it's going to really, accelerate. So what Bacon's Rebellion does is that really what it really talks about how you use the law to divide people of different phenotypes. And then you assign, as Robin Kelly said, and I just really like what Robin D. Kelly said. And if you ever get an opportunity to watch a documentary, it's called Race, the Power of an Illusion. He talks about how the poor whites then start to identify with wealthier whites, right? Because the law was giving them just a little bit incentive that made them different from darker skinned people, right? Because again, we're still creating the concept of race. So darker skinned people, they give them just a little bit more privileges, and then they use that word white in 1671. And so now it becomes like a linchpin to make poor whites feel some level of allegiance with the bourgeoisie or the elite class. And so then, therefore, Bacon's Rebellion is going to be this goal to sort of stop the working class people from working together. And they're going to do it by phenotype, but they're going to reinforce it through the law. And they're going to use incentives in the law, right? And consequences in the law to make people not want to engage in sort of, this is why this conversation, and even when you hear things like law and order, it is because the law within itself is there, particularly in our nation, to foster the power of the elite. And so you see that very early on when Governor Berkeley, comes up and they now create this system of, again, creating this incentivized area where you try to stop people from forming alliances. And now I want to get ready to tell you about a story that, again, sort of challenges that. And it works successfully. So are there any other questions, or did I answer your question?
Yes, thank you. Does anyone else have a question? I'm scrolling through looking for raised hands. Okay, Dimitri.
Thank you very much. I just want to thank you and tell you this is one of the greatest lectures I've ever heard in my 74 years of life. And I'm looking forward to reading all your books and articles. You have me on pins and needles. I'm learning so much, and I want to thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. Oh, wow. Thank you. Okay, now I'm hoping that I can keep up the momentum. Thank you, Dimitri. Thank you. I really appreciate that. Oh, wow. Thank you. Thank you. All right. And so now I'm going to go in because I want to respect everybody's time. I now want to go to another part. Now this is called the antebellum period. So the antebellum period is a period in which it's between the American Revolution and the American Civil War. So let me tell you. So again, I'm focusing on, in this lecture, I am saying on the redhead, Thomas Jefferson, because Thomas Jefferson not only gave us the Declaration of Independence, but then he also did several things. He created, he helped to create West Point. And again, because he believed in a trained military corps, but then he did what to America? He doubled the size of the nation. Now, why is this important? It's because that doubling size of the nation is going to lead into the American Revolution. The American Civil War. Because now what they tried to do in Philadelphia, right, was to hammer out when they got together and they created the Constitution. They tried to hammer out a lot of the representation issues and the like sort. But remember, they were dealing with set territories. So when Thomas Jefferson purchased, right, he went against, he didn't believe in expansion and the government's money buying land, but he did it anyway. Again, he's a paradox, all right? So what he did was when he purchased Louisiana, he basically doubled the size of America. And doubling the size of America, though, is going to now lead to these questions about industry and agriculture. It's going to lead to these questions about what are you going to do with that expanded territory? Because one of the things that they hammered out in Philadelphia was representation. And I could get into some conversations about that, but for right now, I'm just going to keep it to the representations and, again, how do they bring in and, counting people for, the House of Representatives. So what happens is that, so the redhead doubles the territory, and in doing so, right, he now starts to exacerbate this question about the slavery. Now, here's a beautiful thing, you all. Again, so these indirect consequences, right? So when he did that and he doubled the nation, now you start having people have, hey, look, this is riddled with some contradictions. And one of the people that emerged, please, 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 his name is David Walker. And he wrote something called David Walker's Appeal. He was a writer and he was a seller of something, the very first Black newspaper, with his Freeman's Journal, right? And so, Freedom's Journal. And so what happens is that he wrote an appeal, and you all, the appeal was revolutionary, because what he said is that, look, again, using that Declaration of the Independence, right? He says, we have to actualize and make this happen. If you're gonna say it, you need to be what you say that you're going to be. And again, it's David Walker's Appeal. You can Google anything about David Walker. Again, his mother was free. So his father was an enslaved person. His mother was free. The status of the child followed that of the mother. So he was born free. And then the next thing he did was that, he used his wit and his moving around. He found allies, right? And some of the allies that he fell into in Boston, because he ended up going to Boston, right, is that, this anti-slavery circle. And those anti-slavery circles were, again, calling out the contradictions in the nation. And he wrote a David Walker's Appeal. And he was one of the first. And this what made his, it's interesting, it raised his profile. Southerners hated him, but at the same time, they started subscribing to his papers. Yeah, figure that out, right? So his popularity grew, even though he was, they had a disdain for him. And then people sort of looked at his work, but he was one of the ones that first said, to bring about liberty to all, it may be an armed resistance. Now, think about how, you bring about, revolution. And he said it may be an armed resistance. He went through, he used all of the classic literature. He used it all. And it was just a phenomenal piece of work, David Walker's Appeal. And unfortunately, he ended up dying fairly young. Again, he ended up catching, he ended up catching, I think it was tuberculosis, and he died from that young. But what he did was that he was one of the first people to suggest that a way that slavery is going to leave a nation is going to be an interracial, interclass coalition, and he recruited for that. And his appeal recruited for that. Now, why I want you to know him is because one of the movement, when he dies, one movement that is going to emerge, that is going to, the most successful reform movement in American history in the 19th century is the abolitionist movement all day long. There is no dispute. The abolitionist movement was a interracial. It had, people with whatever their identity when it comes down to gender. It was women, it was men, it was, again, we are now getting more and more stories about various people who participated, as the indigenous people say, the two-spirit people. And so now what you're having is that you are having this group, right? Now I want you to think about abolitionists. Many of the people who participated were women. They did not have the right to vote. They were actually under something called Republican motherhood and coverture. But what happens is that they didn't have that. But what did they do? They now started to sort of push. They start to write petitions. And that's going to end up going to their movement. That's why I was saying one movement impacted the other. And so, but what happens is, to get back to the abolitionist movement. So I want you to understand that the first abolitionist movement, that's why I want to talk about Shirley Graham Du Bois. The first abolitionist movement in this nation that were created for women, were about Black women in that Boston area. And then 2 years later, you're going to get an interracial movement in Philadelphia. It's called the Philadelphia Female Anti-Slavery Society. And those movements are now going to, again, start to put pressure. Now, at no time in American history did abolitionists make up more than white abolitionists make up more than 5% of the population. But when they joined with their allies, those Blacks. Now, you know, the first abolitionist is the enslaved person who put one foot in front of the other. Now, we do know that, right? You know, those names we don't even know. That's why I love the story of, you know, the abolition, because a lot of names that really were powerful in the movement were the enslaved people who did what are the freedom seekers. That's what we call them now. It's that the freedom seekers did what? They said no to the, you know, they denied the bourgeoisie their property by putting one foot in front of the other. And then by putting one foot in front of the other, those people like those Quakers, Unitarians, and all these people who said they didn't believe in slavery, now they forced their agenda. So the enslaved people, right, the freedom seekers, they actually forced the conversation in the nation. They are basically doing what? They're finishing the business that Philadelphia didn't finish at the Constitutional Convention. Those people who did what? Self-emancipated by running away. They sparked the conversation. They were supposed to just be chattel property, right? But no, what they did was they sparked the conversation, that abolitionist movement. And so what happens is, and so when they spark that, you now have ally building. And now you have people who are doing what? They're writing petitions, they're selling, they're fundraising. They're really, that's why I wanted to concentrate on the women, because they're working for below. Women were not supposed to be in the public sphere, but through abolitionism, they're able to enter the public sphere. Now, why is this important? Because it tells a story about people who may not seem to have power, but they took power. That's radical. That's revolutionary. And then you have now this cross segment of a group of people who, you know, again, worked together, petitioned together. Many of them were beaten. Many of them suffered violence. Frederick Douglass actually had a limp hand, just like Sojourner Truth. They call it a disease hand, right? She had a disease hand. Frederick Douglass was actually disabled partially when he was basically given a speech, and a mob chased after him. But you had people like Elijah Lovejoy, who was actually, was murdered. Again, a white guy who was a journalist, a white man who was a journalist. It was a beautiful interracial cross, class movement that did what? It sparked the American Civil War. Now, the reason I want to relate this to America 250 is this. This is to form a more perfect union. And now you get, after the American Civil War, we get three major amendments. The first one is 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery except for the punishment of crime. The 14th Amendment is what we now see have in our conversations about, birthright citizenship and the right to due process. But I'm also going to put this one in. I hope you're listening. If you look at the 14th Amendment, it's one that they don't teach you. And it's really about the bourgeoisie going against the bourgeoisie, right? Because you had the industrialists in the North going against the agricultural giants and slave owners, human traffickers in the South. And they were trying to determine what vision that the nation was going to go in, who was going to be, what controlling elite was going to have the most prominent voice. That's the American Civil War. Now, what happens is, in the 14th Amendment, put me to the test. The one thing that you always get, birthright citizenship, due process. What you don't get is Section 4 of the 14th Amendment, which basically says that the North will not compensate at all the property that the Southerners lost. Now, why is this important? The most valuable asset at the eve of the American Civil War was that enslaved population. Google it. They worth more than the railroads, more than the banks, more than everything in the American economy was those 4 million enslaved, because they were producing, like when you go to Great Britain, remember it was a global market. So here we are having people, my ancestors down in Mississippi, let's just take Mississippi in those areas. They were producing in Great Britain, the industrial giant of the world at the time. They were producing those 4 million black, well, you know, the ones who were in the cotton industry. They were producing 77% of the cotton that was used by in the global market for Great Britain. So slavery was not some regional aspect. No, it was global. So what you have with these black people in the North and then their white allies in the South, and again, various groups. When I say various whites, various ethnicities, what happens is that they did what? That's why I said it was a sexual reform movement. You all, they forced the elite to go against one another to lead to an emancipation. And again, a lot of blacks were self-emancipating through the Underground Railroad. And then when they got an opportunity to fight in the American Civil War and they got to those Union lines, so you got self-emancipation and you got people working together, and they basically did what? And I said, Section 4 of the 14th Amendment, Northerners said, we're not going to compensate you. And they had the most valuable asset. So blacks forced a conversation by putting one foot in front of the other. That's why they're crucial, not only in the story of the American Revolution, but then in the story of the American Civil War. And then even after, during the American Civil War, the United States colored troops, I love their story here. Here's another story. So they weren't getting compensated fairly. They were not, getting compensated fairly. So guess what? They didn't take any money until they got paid fairly. Again, so here's this beautiful story about people who were, again, a lot of these people who were in the United States colored troops were enslaved people, right? And they did what? They not only, again, many of them self-emancipated, forced a conversation, but then they turned around and they, again, had this nation, right, go into a conflict. But these are supposed to be people who didn't have a voice, who were not, they were chattel property, and they forced the conversation. Now, at that moment, I'm going to pause here just in case anybody have any questions. Again, that was a quick summary, and right now we're at 49 after, and I know that we only have a few more minutes. So right now, are there any questions about that? So that's the antebellum period.
Okay, we're scrolling through again. If you have a comment or question, please click the picture of the raised hand. Jacob?
Hello there. Thank you so much, Tanya, for the incredible presentation so far. The lecture's been really eye-opening. I really appreciate it. I just had one quick question. Would you say that beyond self-emancipation, was there any kind of legal framework or legal work that was maybe a requirement, or at least like a stepping stone to enable the abolitionist movement's success? Or was this almost extra legal, extra, judicial? Thank you.
Yes, now that's it. The abolitionists were most definitely operating outside of the law, because at the talk, Jacob, that's an excellent question. The law was actually supporting the Southern perspective. One of a major lawsuit is one that's actually called the Dred Scott decision. In the Dred Scott decision, there was a Southern sympathizer. His name was Roger Taney. And so what happens is he actually wrote these words. He said that no black had a right that white men were bound to respect. And so therefore, when you sort of look at the legal framework, so let me go back before, that was in 1857, but I want to go back to something 1850. There's something called the Compromise of 1850. The Compromise of 1850, basically one of the conditions was the Fugitive Slave Act. The Fugitive Slave Act basically made every white person in America a slave catcher. They could be deputized by any human trafficker. And you ready for this, Jacob? If they captured a black person and they went to court, now the black person couldn't testify. if the black person was proven guilty, according to the Fugitive Slave Act, then they got, the person who captured them got $10. If they were proven to be in person who was not a person who was born free or had their freedom, they got 5. So the law itself incentivized finding black people guilty. Sounds familiar? So now you get sort of the origins of that, right? This whole idea about this system. You get dual court systems, beginning of some of that. I mean, not beginning, but again, the continuation of that. In the law, it gets incentivized to find black people guilty. And the Fugitive Slave Act helped to do that. And then what happens is in the 1857 decision, Dred Scott. But let me give you a beautiful story with this. This is why I'm gonna Jacob, you brought up something that I have to tell you about. But then that system, those allies, right, who basically go back to David Walker, and one of the major allies was a guy by the name of John Brown. And John Brown said the only way that this country would get rid of slavery, pretty much, affirming what David Walker had written before, was through the purge of, by the purge of blood, by purging it with blood. And John Brown, so in black culture, you will not find a critical voice of John Brown. Harriet Tubman called him Captain Brown. Frederick Douglass said, "I live for the enslaved or the slave." John Brown died for him. In the 1960s, Malcolm X, H. Rap Brown, all of them praised John Brown. So here I am, a Southerner. I grew up with, when a friend of mine, we got into a situation once where we did some stuff we had no business doing. She was black. She's white. I'm black. And what happens is that we looked at this situation. It was a flat tire on a car, right? We had no business. We ended up leaving the campus, the high school campus. We weren't supposed to. So again, we went out there. I lived near a beach, I told you. So we would go down and we would run down to the beach and eat lunch down there and then go back to campus. And so what happens is, we get there one day, Jacob, and we're, just having fun, singing on the beach or whatever. And then we get there, and guess what? Her car, the tire is flat. So she said, "I'll be John Brown." I looked at her and I said, "Girl, this ain't no good thing. What are you talking about?" Because now that she's like, there were 2 Southern experiences, right? So John Brown came to sort of signal or symbolize. For black folks, we'll be, "Ooh, I'll be John Brown." That was good. For white Southerners, "I'll be John Brown" was bad. And for the first time in our relationship of 6 years, that we were best friends, that was really the first time that Southern black and Southern white perspective was different. So I say that to say the law itself actually was on the Southerner side. That's why I wanted to read the Declaration of Independence, because the Southerners would argue that they're no longer consenting to the government, because they felt that the government, with the election of Abraham Lincoln and also the acts of John Brown at Harper's Ferry, that this was Northerners that were going so far off of the agreement that they had to succeed. Now, let me tell you, Jacob, you asked the question, and I'm glad you did. And I want you to sort of look this up for yourself. I want you all to look up Alexander Stephens. He was the vice president of the Confederacy. And he wrote something called the Cornerstone Speech. And what he says in the Cornerstone Speech is that they were, the South, the Confederate States of America, was creating a document that had never been seen in the world, in which it argues that the white man, the black man's natural position was under that of a white man. So this alliance that the abolitionists had to force this conversation that Philadelphia didn't deal with in 1787, that end up going to, eventually the Emancipation Proclamation and the formal end of slavery with self for the punishment of crime, was again this conversation that was done by a small group of people, but they were revolutionary. And there was a lot of, again, allies, and they were willing to go the distance. And that's the beauty of that story. But again, that's how the perception would work. And again, how the laws, again, were really on the side of the Southerners. When you look at, I teach the steps to the American Civil War from 1850 to 1860, basically, except with the exception of, again, with the election of Lincoln. You're going to see that the law was constant because John Brown was hung. He was hung for treason. So again, even that act of hanging John Brown was still telling Southerners, right, that we will, handle these folks if they are, contrary to the law. So John Brown was hung, but then when the election of Lincoln came, that's when the Southerners were like, this is just so much. Let's let us come back. So they had to get out of that consent agreement. And so that's why when we look at these two documents, the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, someone like Frederick Douglass, and again, Frederick Douglass in a speech called the What to the Slave is the 4th of July, it become a speech initially, and then it become a pamphlet. What he does is that he argues that the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution makes room for the emancipation, and it can be used for people from the below, from the bottom of the hierarchy. And then that's why Alexander Stephens is actually going to affirm what Douglass says in his cornerstone speech by saying we're creating the first constitution in the world that recognizes white supremacy. So the war was over, again, those enslaved people, but I wanted to let it be known, those enslaved people, right? Right? We hold these truths to be self-evident. By putting one foot in front of the other, they made themselves to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. They were making their plans. Now, again, there's a whole story. I can go into the resistance on plantations and the like sort, but really, at this moment, again, that galvanizing of the abolitionist movement. So with the abolitionist movement is going to, again, give way to the women's rights movement. And if you look at the women's rights movement, it's going to have something called the Declaration of Sentiments. They're going to use the language of the Declaration. And then that women's rights movement is going to go into the women's suffrage movement, right? And so when that happens, because voting is important, right? So what happens is that when that happens, again, it's going to spark other movements. So thank you, Jacob, for that question. And I think now it's now looking at 8:59. So again, I'm gonna feed a little bit into what I want you to know about Shirley Graham Du Bois. And I'm gonna pick up on Thursday. I'm doing another talk, so I'm gonna pick up more about her to bring us to this next part. So again, I was going into the names of the unknown. Again, I mentioned some proper names like Frederick Douglass. I mentioned David Walker. But let me just explain that you had the people. It was a general people. It was people of names we don't know. That's the power of the masses. See, when you get into the cult, the cult of personality, you understand that thwarts revolution. Because now it's always looking for that one person as opposed to having it. So that one person, remember I told you how Nathaniel Bacon dies or David Walker died. If you sort of look for, if something happens to one person, then the movement itself can be thwarted. But what I explained to you is that when you're looking at that abolitionist movement, it was always not great stories. It was a lot of abuse. It was a lot of violence. But because of that movement, right, you had people who will maybe never know their name, but they did an upheaval. A lot of abolitionists who were helping on the Underground Railroad, black and white, they were, we'll never know a lot of their names, but they were assisting in bringing about, again, a transfer of wealth, and they basically by the Constitution itself not recognizing, right, that compensation for the loss of property is revolutionary, and they started that conversation. So what Shirley Graham Du Bois, because she studied history, so oftentimes people like to look again at her husband. Her husband comes into the Communist Party in 1961. Shirley Graham Du Bois was in the Communist Party in the 1940s and 50s. In fact, she became a There was, when she wrote this, so let's tell you, she had this opera. One thing about the media, and be careful about how the media tells stories and the like sort. So she actually ended up writing an opera. It was the first one that sort of come on scene by a Black woman, and it's called Tum Tum. And what she did with Tum Tum is that she traced African American history from Africa to the Harlem Renaissance, the 1920s. And what she did was that she used, you can't make this stuff up. She hired people who were local. That's all. She wrote the story herself, and it was a big extravaganza. I mean, she actually had real animals. When she was having animals in some of these pieces, they had real animals. This is a Black woman who was able to use her genius, right? And she believed in equity even when she was having those when she did Tum Tum. And then she would go on and she would work again, working for equality, looking at the stories of women, looking at the stories of, I'm just gonna, because I got the time and I know I'm gonna now try to wrap up, so I'll pick this up on Thursday. But Shirley Graham Du Bois did this to give you sort of a piece about who she was. So what happens is that she was so effective at bringing about equity in conversations that this woman went after her. It's like a female Joseph McCarthy went after her, accused her of the organization that she was working with, the YMCA, that they were YWCA, that they were just harboring communists, and she ended up getting fired. And also, what happens is that actually galvanized her even more. Her son also died a tragic death by not getting treatment in a hospital. That's what she believed. And it galvanized her even more. And so what happens is she would marry Du Bois in 51. And again, he didn't become a communist until 1961. It is my contention that he was around the activities because she was, again, Du Bois, again, he, at one time, he had, was friends of the communists, but then he actually ended up going, and then he coming back in 61. And, he hides his platform of why he is joining the party. But she was already there, and the Chinese, when they were in China, and they were already in the daily paper. I mean, she was, well respected. She worked across various countries. She knew how to build a broad coalition of people, an alliance of people across, right? Because of her experiences, because she actually traveled when she was younger. She went to Paris and she met some Africans and people of different ethnicities. And then she was able to make that correlation between class, right, and oppression. And so she brought that back to the United States. And again, she put it in her journalism, because she was a journalist. She put it in her activism. And what happens is, again, she became such a huge name because, again, she actually won various awards. And I'll talk about that on Thursday. And she became a huge name, but that means she also became a target. And so what happens is it sort of pushed her out of the United States. And when she went abroad, she was able to even build a larger platform. And her work with, in China is just impressive and extraordinary. And they buried her, right, with, again, high honors and respect. So I'm going to pick back up on that again. But Shirley Graham Du Bois, I want to say that again, Du Bois, when he says why he joined the party, I know because Du Bois was a major force himself, but one of the things that he says is, again, I'll give you a little bit more about her and about how she was really with a group called Sojourners for Truth and Justice. But Du Bois makes this argument, and this is going to be my last, about why he joins the party. And he writes this in 61. But again, Shirley Graham Du Bois, they have been married now for 10 years. And he says, communism cannot reform itself. It is doomed to self-destruction. No universal selfishness can bring social good to all, communism, the effort to give all men what they need and to ask of each the best they can contribute. This is the only way of human life. It is a difficult and hard end to reach. It has and will make mistakes, but today it marks triumphantly on in education, in science, in home and food, with increased freedom of thought and deliverance from dogma. And then he basically does what? He lists his reasons, almost like to me, when I read his letter, I sort of see the declaration because I see his preamble and then he gives his reasons, right? And so then he ends with in many ways, a declaration by saying that no nation can call itself free, which does not allow its citizens to work for these ends. So I'm going to end there because again, I'm going to again pick up on this relationship. So Du Bois's letter, when he joins the Communist Party in 1961, is really, again, he wrote a book called Black Reconstruction in 1935. Remember, he would have studied the very things that I talked about, and he did talk about them in Black Reconstruction, right? Again, this ideology, this long struggle. But again, it's this beautiful struggle from the people from below who did magnificent Herculean work in the sparked revolution. And they would continue to have and continue to impact the conversation of liberty. Liberty, liberty, liberty. All right. And with that, if there are any more questions, I'm sorry, my dog that's my dog down there making all the sense. I'm sorry.
Okay, we're scrolling for the last time for raised hands. I see your hand, Bonnie.
Can you hear me?
We can now.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Oh, what a pleasure to hear you. First, I want to say thank you to Dee and the comrades who organized these 4 sessions. And unfortunately, I'm going to have to miss Saturday's session because our club is having a fundraiser for Cuba. And so, of course, I want to know if you're going to, if there'll be recordings we can look at later for any of the sessions we miss.
Yes, it's going to, all of these are being recorded.
Good, great. Okay. And well, how lucky your students are to have you.
Thank you.
And I tried to find a list of your books online, but I couldn't find.
Right now, process of actually completing one. So thank you, Bunny. I'm going to make sure that everybody knows that because I have a public lecture.
Yeah, we don't have a chat in this thing, so I couldn't type in my chat, so that's why I raised my hand. Anyway, what a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Bonnie. Thank you. And
thank you, Dee. Go ahead. Sorry.
Thank you, Dr. Tonya. Thank you, Bonnie.
All right. I say just one piece, just sort of again go into this piece about how revolution works, right? Remember, it's ongoing, and it requires allyship, and it requires not seeing the superficial pieces. Like right now, I mean, you see in people, and I was just in Cuba 2 years ago, and it was absolutely an extraordinary experience for me, and just to see the solidarity that's among Cubans. And what I love is that they don't put American policy with American people. They understand that that is something from the elite, and they don't necessarily point fingers at Americans. They point fingers at policy. And I think that we can really benefit from learning that, because again, the big pieces is scapegoating, and we go to people. But again, when I was there 2 years ago, it was extraordinary. And right now I'm on my way to Guatemala. I'll be in Guatemala next week, going to looking at, again, unfortunately the genocide there, but then again, the resistance among the people and how that, impacted and shaped. So thank you so much. Thank you so much, Bonnie.
Okay, for the last time, we're looking for raised hands. We're scrolling through looking for raised hands. Please be encouraged to offer your comment or question. And I don't see any more raised hands.
So can I end then with this then, right? And so one of my favorites And I know there are, many club songs, and I know there are many songs, but one of my favorites, I started this conversation talking about African American History Month. So there was the African American History Month, week, then month. What happens is there was in 1900, there was two brothers. They wrote a song, and in that song, they wrote it for Abraham Lincoln. It was a resistance song, literally because they were in Florida, and we know that the Confederacy was high. So what they did was they taught Black children this song. And then what happens is the year later, they actually end up going to New York. It was James Weldon Johnson and his brother, Rosman Johnson, J. Rosman Johnson. And they left. But then what happens is the kids kept singing the songs and they grew up. And within 20 years, that song was picked up by the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, as being the national Negro anthem. And I want to end that, if you don't mind, I want to end this talk with some of the most beautiful words. It started off as a poem. And again, I want to say it was to commemorate Lincoln's birthday in the land of the Confederacy, which was burning them up because, again, their catechisms teach them to hate Lincoln, right? So it's, again, a revolutionary piece. But one of the things that they said was lift every voice and sing. So again, if you don't mind, let me just indulge. Lift every voice and sing till earth and heaven ring, ring with the harmonies of liberty. Let our rejoicing rise high as the listening skies. Let it resound loud as the rolling sea. Sing a song full of the faith that the dark past has taught us. Sing a song full of the hope that the present has brought us. This is my favorite part. Facing the rising sun of our new day begun, let us march on till victory is won. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Tanya. We hope everyone will join us Thursday night, 8 p.m. Eastern, for this class part 2. And also, please join us on Saturday at 12 p.m. Eastern for our final conversation with Joe Sims on stopping the civil rights counter-revolution. So thank you again, and we look forward to Thursday night. Good night, everyone.